Roby Price, and welcome to my workshop.
Well, I'm just back from Knoxville. I got a very specialty piece of wood. It's going to be for a Christmas present. And it is a little early yet. We haven't even gotten to Thanksgiving. But you got to start these things early. Otherwise, when your family descends upon us, you have no secrets. Let's get that out of the back of the truck and get inside. I think you'll be surprised at what I've found.
Let's build a keepsake. A Box for the Boy, Part 1.
Well, here's the prototype. It's made out of curly maple, soft curly maple, and that's not as soft as you think it is. It's got plenty of room for correspondence and keepsakes that you think are special. I like the handle. I think that's something else. The top is very thin, and it's book matched on either side, and it's reinforced with through dovetails that float. So this is going to be a piece that will last a long time. It's got very unique corner legs and a field right here that is contoured. This is a good looking piece. Now, there's a lot of old and new in this piece. These legs right here are made with the shaper origin. They're attached to the field where the cove moldings are made on the table saw. And when it comes down to it, these are mortise and tenon joints on both corners. And that's a lot of floating tenons to squeeze into a space this small. Now, the prototype here is out of curly maple, and I'm looking forward to it in my house. But the project is going to be out of dappled Sapele, and this is an African wood. It's called African Mahogany, and this particular board has more figure in it than I've seen in a board in a long time. This is going to be something else. Now, things we're going to change are very few. We are going to not do the book matched edge on the top. This got a little too thin, and I would like to have a little bit more contour. Beyond that, everything is going to be the same. So the first thing that we want to do is take a look at the computer files that the shaper origin uses to make these legs. Then we need to get to the saws and make some blanks. Finally, making this contoured edge was hard enough with this figured maple. With this right here, I'm not too sure how it's going to work. I'm not worried about the table saw. I am worried about the hand scrapers and hand planes. We'll see how that goes. So, nothing happens till you get started. I'll see you in the office. I'm in the study, and on my computer I have my program Inkscape up and running. I use that to build my SVG files and my thumbnails. So I'm getting more and more familiar with this program. What you see here in blue, this blue outline, is a blank, and I will take that over to my workstation. This gives me plenty of room to clamp down here and here. The remainder, the black, is what's going to be left over after I make the cut. Now, you're probably thinking, that's just going to fall off, and you would be right. So what we will do is we will take the cut right on up to the end, this point here and this point here, leaving the rest of it. We'll cut that off on the table saw. Now, this is just one file amongst many. There's about 6 to 8 of these things we've got to send over to the shaper origin. We do that with the shaper hub, and it's nothing more than some file manipulation. So I'm not going to get into that here, but I just wanted you to see this so you would have some understanding of what I'm using to make my cuts. We'll look at this a little closer once we get outside at the shop. Once the files are uploaded, these outlines right here will define the pieces that I need, and that's what I'll be cutting out on the table saw and getting set up on the jointer. And once our blanks are cut, then we can really start. But until then, I've got some work to do behind the computer before we can really get out to the shop.
The first thing to do is to take the board over to the jointer and get a good straight edge on one side. The second thing to do is to take about 10 inches off that dust collection hose. That is distracting. This board looked pretty good, but I like to inspect the ends. If there are any checks or splits, That can really impact the material in the center of the board. So cutting off the first 2 inches is a matter of course for me. I give it a good bend and a good test to see if the wood is stable. If it is, I move on. If not, I think it's time to trim off a little extra. We'll cut 2 lengths for the sides. One long side and one short side will be together. And I'll take a little extra care to make sure that I keep the grain direction moving around the box consistently. The boards are cut to width on the table saw, about 5 inches. The remainder will be used for the corner columns. There's a little twist to every board, and that's one of the things that face jointing takes out. Always mark your boards, otherwise you'll never know where you were, where you are, or when you're finished. Apply pressure to the opposing corners. The ones that wobble are not the ones that you want to apply pressure to when jointing. That will bring the low points up to the high points as quickly as possible, and with the least amount of material loss. Also remember that a cup is much easier to joint than a bow. Never joint a bow if you can help it. Now that we have a flat face, we can go to the planer. That'll give us a uniform thickness. Check the edge for square and then joint one end. We'll parallel it up on the table saw. There's not nearly as much movement in this one, although he is cut that way. This one is really whopper jawed, but I've got this area here that I want to keep. Now, right now, I've got about an inch. In fact, right at an inch. That's not going to hold. So I need 7/8 maximum, and that's what I want to use for these pieces. So I'm going to dimension these, but I'm going to do it separately on the planer, and they don't have to be the same. But with anything, you need to know where you've been. So since this is like this, we will do this side first. I finished dimensioning the columns, and now it's time to cut them to length. I'm using both of my combination squares in order to achieve a perfect measure from the edge of the carbide tip on the table saw, and from there I will get my stop put in place. This is flat with that, that's flat with that, and that touches this. So I can bring this even with that. Now I've got an angle cut there to make that work. We'll make the first cut, and it should be perfect, but it always pays to check. After that, we'll cut the remainder. Looks good. It pays to have a few extra. Some of these pieces have one edge that's not dimensioned, and that's okay. As long as we have a dimensioned face pressed against the fence, we can get a good clean cut. This will become apparent when we go through the video.
My blanks are all cut with the exception of the top and the handle. And I've taken some time with my legs right here to mark them. I need to do this because this wood has an enormous amount of chatoyance in one direction. In the other direction, it's really quite plain. So what I want to do is I want to make the long face, which is typically on display, the one up front. And that's going to be the one that gets all the figure. So I have got my center marked here with a square. And as you can see in the illustration, I've got my long sides and I've got my short sides marked. In addition to that, I have put marks on each side how I want this to go. This will impact how I put it in the Shaper Origin workstation. So I want to make sure these are marked. You'll also notice these blanks are a bit longer than the legs, and that's on purpose. All this is going to become clear as soon as we get to the workstation, mount up these blanks, and start cutting. So let's do that right now. This is the file, and it is to scale. This is side B, which corresponds to this over here. I have my shape identified there, which corresponds to this shape. I have this over here and that over here, which corresponds to that, and we will cut this out. Additionally, I have 4 mortises drawn. For this piece, which was one of the blank for the first, I'll cut the mortise here and I'll cut the mortise here. And then I will take this, and when I do that, I will cut this mortise here and that mortise here. Additionally, I can't really do it that way. I've got to turn this over like this. And to do that, I take side B. Now, this is perfectly centered in the frame. So when I index against this stop, it's in exactly the same place. Now, this, and this are touch points that the router bit will look at, and it will orient this piece with the field, and that's how it knows where it's supposed to be. All this seems technical, but we'll get a couple of shots above. I just wanted you to understand why this are in specific places. I wanted you to see the file and understand how this relates to what we're doing. I also wanted you to see this and notice I leave some of it here. We'll clean that up on the table saw. We'll knock these off later. But that little piece right there is what holds that in piece after it's all been cut. And it does keep it very stable.
I typically initiate a new scan with each piece. That ensures the shaper origin understands where all the dominoes are, and it records that through 2 small cameras. It's the triangulation that lets it know where the router bit is at any given time. Once the scan is complete, we log it into memory.
Well, now it's time to import. So we'll go to our file and we'll import it in, and you can see it right there. That's what we're going to cut. I need this to be as centered on that grid as I can. And it's off, and that's because my snap is too large. And I know this. So, this is a little bit of trial and error here. So we're going to position this, and we'll position, and the X is 3.75. And you can see now the X has come in line with the edge of the grid now. And on the Y, it was a little bit more difficult. It was 0.4375. It was a 16th off, and notice it kept the negative. So I'll say done there. And now I should be in place. So I'll press place. Now when I come over here, you'll see that I'm right on the grid right there, and that's what I wanted. Also, you'll note the green line right here, that's what we want to cut. And we're going to get set up to cut that here in just a moment. All right, there's a number of steps that have to take place to get ready for this. As you can see, my file is up. However, a number of changes we want to make. First of all, I don't want to cut a 1/2 inch on this immediately, so we'll take that down to an 1/8 of an inch. Second, you see I'm cutting right on the line and not to the outside of the line. So we'll come over here and we'll go outside. So now I'm cutting the outside. Also, I don't want to cut exactly on there because I want a finishing pass. So we will take it to 0.1, and now we're farther out. Finally, I want to change my bit. I've got a 1/4 inch bit in the spindle, and this is saying an 1/8. So I want to come over here and I want to change it to a 1/4 inch bit. Now you see that it wants me to Z-touch. It knows if I've changed the bit in here, the height is not the same. So we have to come over to the table. That's going to be over there. I'll come over here, and I know I'm not in camera, but watch this, because when I say Z-touch, it goes down and touches, and then it comes back up. Now it knows the depth. So at this point, we're ready to cut. And all I have to do is get my dust collection hooked up, and I just have to get after it. Some takeaways from our first pass. One, I am way too tight right here, so I'm going to end up backing this off a good bit. The only thing I need to do is to have the center of the bit just a little bit inside this corner so I can come away. Second, my piece is deeper than 1/8 inch, and I may have to take a saw curve and cut right here so that this piece can fall away without issue. I don't want this rummaging around with a bit like that. I'm good all the way up to here. This is a good place to stop. It gives me plenty of room, plenty of meat here. Now, things to note. This is, in essence, that first cut. Actually, no, it's this first cut. And then we will take this piece and turn it this way to get that cut. After that, we will go back to here, which is a flat face here, and we will make this mortise and that mortise there. Then we will turn this around and turn him this way to do this mortise and this mortise. And the reason we can do this is that this shape right here is perfectly centered within those bounds. Also, I will give, these are the mortises that I'm cutting, but my floating tenon has a little bit of lanyap in there. So I can adjust that a little bit. This is how we're going to proceed forward. It's a lot of cutting, and I'm not going to put you through that. It's time to put the new technology aside for a moment, but to recap, it worked well for us. I've got 4 columns right here, and the mortises are in the right place for each. And my old school markings served me well. I've got the grain direction in the right orientation, and that's important. The handle as well turned out very nice. Little mortise right there for the cross beam that connects the 2 posts. This will work out well. But it's time to put that aside. We're getting ready to start the side panels, and this is the shape that we're looking at. It's a very nice kind of a Bombay shape, and I'm very much, this is going to look very nice. It looked great on the prototype piece. And if I take one of these columns and you look at it, right there on top, you don't have much meat on the outside. And I am looking to have a reveal just like the prototype, and the meat on this is thin as can be. So we're going to approach this maybe a little differently. I hit this square on and was really stressing over this particular measurement, but we hit it, and the prototype looks great. On this particular piece of stock, I've got more width than I had with my curly maple. So we'll take this and we will build this shape. We will narrow it down and sneak up with it on the jointer. And I think that's going to be a much better, safer approach. But let's get started here on the table saw, because making cove moldings on the table saw is a little bit unusual, and I think you'll find this interesting. You could do it on a router table, but you can't get the large coves on a router table because the bit diameter is limited to 3 inches. And here I'm limited to 10 inches. So we can do better, and we will. Let me get set up. You'll see what I'm talking about. What have I got here? Well, I've got the blade set up right here, and I've got a fence right here. And by the way, if you do this, put a little bit of wax on that. It'll make your life simpler. What we're going to do is we're going to take this piece and we're going to pass it through here over the top of the blade. Now, we're not going to try to hog out a bunch of material. This is a long process. You take a little bit at a time. You're probably looking at this piece right now thinking, that ain't too stable. And it's not, but this one is. So there is an order to these events. So what we will do is we will hog out material and we will get this shape in place, and we will have this shape behind the blade to keep it stable, and that's important. Now, when we finish this, we will take it on our fence over there and we'll nip off the bottom. And that'll give us a cove here and some material removed here, and then I'll be honest with you, it's the hand planes and it's the scrapers to try to get the marks out. Now this blade right here is a V-cut blade. If you have a flat blade, that's better. If you have one that's notched on the sides, there are all sorts of types of blades. This one is probably the most aggressive, and it's going to leave the most marks, but it's the blade I've got. The other thing is that we need to be wary of tear out. So at the end of the game, I'm probably going to take the final pass several times to minimize this. Last bit, you're asking why the angle, and is the blade coming up straight or at an angle? There are spreadsheets. You can build them or you can find them on the net. There are 1,001 different ways to orient this particular shape to give you angles. And if you do specific angles and tilt the blades, you can have off-center codes. You can drive yourself nuts with this. All I've done is I found this right here. I knew I wanted basically this shape. When I picked up the saw and shot it with the eye, this is kind of where I came up. But I like this shape. It's the prototype. And I did mark it on the saw so that I can duplicate it on the next piece. Now, after we finish this, I've got a little bit to rip off on the bottom, and I want to keep as much of this flat as possible. Again, stability as we run across. I have a certain height I'm going to pick up the blade, not anymore. And then once we get this done, again, hand planes and scrapers, and a lot of sweat equity. My fence is set up, and it is rock solid, and that's important because we're going to be pushing against it as we go through. A little whack sometimes is a good idea, and it is going to be dusty. So we got our paddles in place. They're a little bit oriented differently. We'll raise the blade a touch, and we'll take this through a pass at a time. Now, dust collection is important, but we're still going to be generating a lot of dust. There's just no way around it. Well, when they built this saw, they did not build the dust collection for this. It's just a mess. And if you've got lung issues, I would suggest you get a respirator. I wanted to point this out because this is important. I've got my cove, and once you start this process, it goes pretty quick. It's not pretty, but it goes pretty quick. If you will leave yourself just a touch of material right here, you'll find out that you're much better off. The stability of this piece as it moves through the blade is a little bit difficult to control with just this flat. Leave yourself some there. Otherwise, if the piece digs in, you're going to have problems. Now, it's not going to go anywhere because you're pushing against the fence. It could come at you if you don't have good pressure on it. So it is important. Leave a little bit of that aside for you. And if you're smart, you'll leave enough down here so that you've got this ability to cut off later. Now, we will trim this off on the table saw, and we'll get a good cut on this. But, you know, I'm kind of liking the way this works. I've got plenty of meat here. We'll clean that up on the jointer. But for now, let's clip this bottom piece off right here so we can continue our shape. Looking at this piece, I'm finding that this is matching up very nicely. I still have some material in the back I can remove. That's easy enough to do on the jointer. And when I look at this profile and I'm matching up here, and then I look at the prototype and the way it tucks up under and matches with the feet, I like this shape. So I'm going to take it, match up the cove, and right here, that's what I'm going to cut off. I will cut this off later after I've jointed the material, but right now, that gives me an idea of how much to take off on the table saw. We'll set the blade at 25 degrees and cut that off.
I'm clamped in the bench and starting to knock the corners off with a block plane. This is a low angle block plane and the blades are sharp. Regardless of that, I am getting some chip out, and that's just a fact of life with highly figured woods. We'll change direction and we'll skew the blade a little farther, trying to minimize that effect. Now that the corners are knocked off, we can start with the scrapers. I did dress this edge prior to the video. I've got a curved scraper right here, and that's perfect for the cove mold. When I try to dress up the corners, I'll switch back to a straight edge. As you can see, there still is some chip out, and we can clean that up because it's in an area where we're going to be taking a little bit more material out anyway.
A couple of things about sanding to make your life simpler. You'll notice that I've got my hose tied to a chain that comes from the ceiling. The hose can just be a total pain in the neck, and it'll get caught on things, move your sander around. You have a tendency to gouge. Look at your hose management, and on top of that, your cord management. I just went ahead and wrapped the cord around the hose because I didn't want to deal with it. And I'm hooked up to dust collection, so when this turns on, I turn on. A second thing, this has a foam pad on it, very soft. And the reason for that is this is contoured work. And I want to round out the corners. I don't want a flat edge trying to guide it. If I have that foam pad, it's naturally going to find the sharp edges and it's going to knock them off, which is perfect for this application. Finally, I did some scraper work and I did some hand planing work. Had to. There's too much material to take off. But consequently, I've got chip out in places. Take yourself a pencil, mark them. You're going to have to mark them a couple of times, but the intent is to take the whole thing down enough to make all that chip out go away. Can't be in the final piece. Unless you're lucky enough to have a piece right there and a piece right here, and you can take that and cut it out. Unfortunately, the grain doesn't cooperate too often, and this chip out just happens where the wood wants it to, not where you want it to. So I have gotten myself playing down, and I'm getting ready to do the final sanding on this, starting with 80 grit. That's right, 80, and then working it all the way up to 220.
It's back to the table saw. It's time to trim the top edge of the board. That's the area that kept our board stable when we were cove molding. We don't need it now. We have the shape we want, but let's check for thickness, and yes, we're a bit too thick. A pass or two at the jointer will solve that problem.
I've arranged my board so I get a continuous grain pattern going all the way around the box. There's always one corner you can't do anything about, but for the most part, we've made an effort, and I'm going to make the rough cut here and the final cut at the table saw. I've put this in the light on purpose. I wanted to illustrate how crisp this line is, and there you can never get it to line up straight. Wood moves a little bit, but this end right here, you can see the sun. The shadow falls off on the end, and that's because the sandpaper rubbed it over like this. So I'll be taking off the majority of this section. This over here, just a tiny little bit. So we'll clean up this edge on the table saw, and we'll remove the rest of it over here. We're making the groove in the base. We're roughly 1/4 inch deep, according to my measure here, and we're 1/4 inch in this way. So we'll make the cut there, and I want 1/4 inch total, so I'll march back in 30 seconds until I complete the cut. While getting set up on the shaper origin, I have to cut, and this is the last task for this machine, I have to cut mortices in the side so that I can put the floating tenons in to make this assembly work. And that's a simple matter of putting it in the machine and cutting it off the same pattern. That's the joy of this particular pattern. I can do it all with one sketch. So that will about do it for today. I think this project can easily be finished up in the next episode. And then maybe we take a third one for the finish. I don't know yet. We'll just see how much time is consumed. But right now, I'm going to finish up with these mortises, and I'll see you next time in Roby's workshop.